Thanks very much for joining us. And before we start off, let me probably aware of our land acknowledgement, but let me acknowledge that we do meet here on the ceded territories of the Latvian people on whose territory the university stands. So it occupies us to and what this means to occupy an uninvited guest on the land of the peoples and the ramifications of our collective endeavors. With this, let me introduce Antje Wiener, who has been the third time you're here, so she's a loyal guest here at the Center for Global Studies. We're very happy to have such a distinguished scholar of international relations coming back to us. As you can see here, Antje holds a chair in political science and global governance at the University of Hamburg, and she has had a very distinguished career as an IR scholar with a particular interest in theory and norms and contestation. Some of you will have heard the talk that she gave on Monday on norms and contestation, theoretically developed framework for studying processes of global governance. And some of this will inform also today's, but here today we will hear something quite different. And you can see here that Antje is currently involved in two projects, and one of them, the one on contested climate justice, is a cluster of excellence. The German universities have this kind of competition, and then particular universities are invited to form these clusters, multidisciplinary clusters. So an important initiative to promote the research excellence on climate change from a very from a multidisciplinary perspective. We will hear about this in a second, but you can see here, if you read through this, how influential and his work has been in the field of IR theory in particular, and with Jim together, they have been founding editors of the Global Constitutionalism that helps to promote scholarly work in this field. And also, you can see here that Antje edits the Norm Research and International Relations series with Springer. So with this, I'm really happy that we also hear about your current research and the research cluster on climate change, and something I haven't heard from you. I've seen it make the news. I think it was on German news quite a bit. One of that how hard it is to get to the 1.5 degree. I think that you find how research shapes public discourse as well. So probably hear a little bit about this. So the plausibility of 1.5 limit is very much in the title here of global warming. So Antje, welcome back again after Monday. Now with a different subject, and the floor is like this.
Well, thank you very much for the kind work. Whilst on Monday I talked about something that is to be written. I'm sure how today I'm presenting the excellence cluster in Hamburg, which is 200 researchers. It's a multi-million-dollar project which lasts over 6 years. We are already working on second application for the next round. And I should also perhaps say, in addition of what other of us said kindly about my career, the theory of contestation has been preconceived here at the center, especially in collaboration with lots of discussions with Jim in the back of the room. So there's a strong influence there, definitely, and which has been carried along through my entire work. I think also my earlier work has been influenced by Canadian contexts. I'm a graduate of the University of Hamburg, where I did my PhD in some time back. Now today, what I want to talk about the what we call the Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook. This is kind of a cross-section, cross-watering assessment of various research streams. It's an interdisciplinary project, and the idea is here to systematically analyze and assess the plausibility of certain well-defined climate futures based on knowledge, on the present knowledge that we could gather, both through our research, but also with reference to the excellent literature. And we looked at social drivers and physical processes this year. I have put some of your names down the list, so you should have received either the hard copies already or they are coming. If you want, they are going to be sent to you, but this report is also available, both the 23 and the 2021 report. We've got two of these reports. I speak to both of them today. I'll do that in 5 steps. First of all, why are we talking about the plausibility, feasibility, or possibility? Then I introduce the assessment framework that we have developed. And then I zoom in into our findings and show a little bit of how we actually did that. Then I expand again with regard to a larger CLICCS assessment framework. You can see the first one is mainly for social drivers, and the second one involves also physical processes. And then I come to a conclusion. First of all, what might sound, especially for those of us who are actually, taking care of our environment and getting a bit irritated sometimes about certain governments' policies and strategic decisions. So to many of us, it will not be not come as a surprise that the societal aspect in climate change is not to be underestimated. For us, it was just when we set up this entire huge, took about 3-4 years preparation, and then the motivation was to say, okay, we've got a lot of data from the natural sciences. We've got the resources around the world. It's not equally distributed, but the resources are there. And we've got sort of the expertise to implement. But all these strategies, all these policies cannot be implemented without society. And that's why we had a very strong impact and focus on society, what the role is that society plays. And that's why we also call it the cluster climate, climatic change, and society. But it is an interdisciplinary project which cuts pretty much across the disciplinary range. So we wanted to find an integrated assessment to look at the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement goals. Obviously, we need to see how compliance with these goals can be reached and what makes this compliance plausible. And not talking about what makes it feasible, which data do we need, because we have most of the data. And so we are looking mainly at emissions and temperature goals. And the leading question is what affects the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature goals. We're looking at 10 social drivers and 6 physical processes. I'll come to that in more detail. This study includes 62 authors from the social sciences, life sciences, and the humanities. And if you look at it in terms of, it might be interesting is because you're also, carrying out large research projects here, and I know that the center is also involved in inter and multidisciplinary research, and we all know with what kind of challenge that comes. Because most of the time, we find ourselves kind of discovering about what we think is a given term. When I was discussing with an economist, a geographer, and a sociologist in the preparatory phase, we couldn't even agree on what governance meant. And I remember when we were kind of talking, somebody took the minutes, and we always took the minutes in our turn. You would leave the room after 2 hours of intensive discussion, everybody took notes. And you look at the minutes and think, oh, that's not what we agreed. So then, you would comment on it. And then you know how we all using track changes. And in the end, from what started out as a kind of black letter document is then in a rainbow color document. And then it's fed into the larger process. I mean, this is one out of 40 projects. And it goes back into this process. So what I sometimes feel when I present this and as I go around the world at the moment, sometimes it sounds pretty banal what you're talking about. But I just wanted to provide a glimpse and unpack what kind of academic work goes into this. And we do this Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook really as a horizontal discussion project, which is in addition to the empirical research that we are undertaking in our sections. I'm a program chair in one section which looks at contested norms in sensitive regions, which includes the Mediterranean and the Arctic. So that's really my research that I'm undertaking with my head on as program chair. But as you see in this climate outlook, the hat I was wearing is really a political science. And that is drawing a lot of the studies that might be of interest as well. Maybe it comes as a surprise. But I was able to draw a lot on the studies of really traditional political science, historical institutionalism, social movement, research, opportunity structures, the work that helped structuring early research in political science. And I was able to bring that in, and you'll see that in a moment. So feasibility or plausibility, we get asked this question quite a lot, especially in the media. What do you mean by plausibility? How can you even, it's very hard for journalists sometimes, and they try to take their mediating role quite seriously, but it's hard for them to grasp how in the social sciences we are able to observe, but we cannot make a 100% sort of secure prediction. That's simply not possible because society is a malleable agent. And it's not just one agent, but we have plenty of agents. We don't even know how many agents. And that is not just society, but we, as we know, as you know, we have more agency than just as human beings. So in the IPCC, feasibility refers to the potential for a mitigation or adaptation option to be implemented. Whereas our outlook is unique in that it offers a comprehensive assessment of enabling and constraining conditions. This rings a bell with historical institutionalism of social drivers, which in historical institutionalism or social movement research, these social drivers would be conceived as social movements. And physical processes that affect the plausibility of a given climate future. And here's really the question, what kind of resources can be produced and used by these social drivers? So we are interested in a range of factors that influence the pathways towards or away from these specific scenarios, so that a feasible pathway may not necessarily be plausible. It might be feasible based on predictions, but then society comes in as a spanner. So we then, that what we present here is a new method for climate futures research, bringing these disciplines together, focusing on plausibility, and we have two assessments, one for the social drivers and one for the integrated framework. And we do this recurrently each year. That's the idea. And the assessment has already been perceived by society and by non-profit organizations in Germany, certainly, so that we have been approached and asked, can't you do that on a larger scale and more regularly, so that German policymakers and politicians can draw on it. And I should say that our cluster colleagues are also advising the Senate, German government. So we are trying to work on that, and we try to now carry it around the world, and it's kind of my part as our CLICCS ambassador, if you wish. So our argument here is that even with given emission scenarios, due to deep uncertainties in some relevant aspects of physical processes, there are limits to determining the probability of some physical elements of climate futures. And what surprised me really, and we'll see that later when we look at the path, is that most of the physical processes are so slowly moving that physical processes in and by themselves don't really implement large changes. It's really more down in society than I would even have expected before. So given the lack of robust probability assessments right now, we developed this alternative framework, to which I will speak in a moment. First of all, briefly, staying below the agreed global temperature limit is not plausible, according to our research now, but the 2-degree goal may become plausible if ambition, implementation, and knowledge gaps are fixed. And again, these knowledge gaps are mostly about how society actually works. So, of the social drivers we looked at, none of the 10 social drivers support deep decarbonization by 2050. But, and I'll speak to the drivers throughout and make direct references. For example, drivers which we find to be pointing in the right direction are climate litigation, knowledge production, and UN climate governance processes. Again, having to expand on that, I have been part of the climate litigation team in the research group and also the knowledge production. And especially, I can say on the knowledge production team, we found that, especially with regard to interviews around the Arctic, that stakeholders generally do not wish to be approached as stakeholders, but as knowledge holders. I think we addressed it earlier. And I also raised with us the point which you may have come across as well, as I said, look, you didn't approach us at the time when you wrote the proposal. Now you approach us afterwards. Why should we do for you that research? We want to partake in it. And that has really made a big change. You could say, well, you know, we're sitting in Germany and other places are much closer to these ways of knowledge production. We do have anthropologists working in Africa and in various regions where we include various regions around the world. But we found this to be so important that we now have a question for all research projects. How does the research involve diverse construction? And diverse ways of knowing has become a key concept. And so that is certainly, perhaps it's you would say retarded learning somewhere in Europe. It's been a steep learning curve, and we have that on board. Now, this may also not come as a surprise that those who are kind of the stringers in the work are corporate responses and consumption patterns. And consumption patterns is very close to us as citizens. And they continue to undermine pathways towards deep decarbonization. Of the 6 physical processes, especially permafrost thaw, amok instability, and Amazon forest dieback, they only moderately inhibit the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature levels. So there we have, obviously, we have I have been asked that before, especially Amazon forest. Amazon forest is a big chapter on how society has an impact, how that also has an impact on other physical processes. That's a special chapter in our report. Now, the social drivers then demonstrate that human agency has a large potential to shape the way climate futures will evolve. It is, however, limited, and we also know that, by conditions of injustice and social inequality, which have a strong negative effect on social dynamics. So you can see, and I certainly have seen that in the report, in the discussions in Australia and New Zealand, where I come from on my way here, that we need to think much more about a political economy of sustainable growth or something in that direction, certainly. I mean, that's what I'm learning. And it seems to me that New Zealand is a very good place to start thinking about that. But that's my personal learning here, and observation is not part of this report yet. So the leading question here, is it plausible that the world will reach decarbonization by 2050? That was our first outlook. 2 years ago. We looked at social drivers as overarching social processes that constitute visible resources, which have the potential to become repertoires towards deep decarbonization. I'll say a little bit more about that with reference to the concept of the global opportunity structure in a moment. But this is the kind of assumption with which we started, what to make of all these resources which are out there. And that's really how we entered the field, and we needed kind of a clearing station to see how do these resources relate to each other, by whom are they actually generated, and what influences that process, and what happens afterwards. Once the resources are there and visible, are they actually used? Are they recognized as something valuable, or are they falling by the wayside? So we needed to assess this a framework. We needed a framework to assess the dynamic of these drivers. In which directions are they likely to move? And this is what it looks like. And we took a strong kind of a social science climate research approach, where we worked with 3 dimensions which we see as underrepresented, often in climate studies. One is history, and the process of drivers as social processes that develop over time, that develop their trajectory. They are not, here, for example, large structures changes. Charles Tilly comes to mind, and he's been very influential in our thinking. And here, the second is the context. What are the enabling constraining conditions? That's much more the rules of engagement on a particular site, in sort of spatio-temporal dependence. And the last one, which is new, is our global opportunity structure concept, which we devised from the political opportunity structure that Herb Kitchen and Sid Tarrow and others have developed in the 1980s, when they were confronted with social movement mobilization that was more successful in some countries than in others. And the question then was, what kind of resources are available? And a Canadian political scientist who I used to work with at Carleton, Jane Jensen, was the only one who basically kind of pushed the power of political agents, so that in that way that she said, well, but social movements also create resources. And one of the resources that she pointed out at the time, and I remember that it was kind of very sort of stuck, was the choice of the First Nations to call themselves First Nations. Self-naming, that's very powerful. And that's the resource that stuck. You could never go beyond that. You can't be first than first. So that was the resource that was constructed and stuck in the discourse. And this scholarship moved on to think about transnational movements, especially if you think in terms of the Hydro-Quebec situation, Quebec and Vermont and the northern United States. So then the question was, how can we actually deal with this in political science? So we found it very helpful, but we needed to move towards not the global level. We don't speak of levels necessarily, but because we have a global sort of trend, global interaction at scales of society and order. So we try to figure out which structures are actually there that influence the global use of resources. So these are our 3 dimensions. And then the components of the social plausibility assessment framework are the chosen future scenario, which you see on the right, very much on the right, the deep decarbonization. You can choose different scenarios, and then we relate back how the drivers refer to that. Then selected key social drivers, and we worked with a selection of 10. Many more are possible. So this is just a selection which reflected our expertise and we needed to draw on the research that we were carrying out. One is UN climate governance. One is transnational initiatives, which draws especially in cities, for example. then climate-related regulation, climate mitigation, journalism, which turned out to be a very complex driver, given that media and the role of the media and the task of the media, the obligations of the media, then the social media, that is very difficult to grasp, and it varies a lot between the countries. Think only about the fact that some countries don't even use printed media anymore. I mean, like New Zealand, I couldn't find a newspaper. That also excludes certain groups of society, and that really and then people live in their own bubbles, and some people don't read papers even though they're available. We find it sometimes hard to get our students to read a paper from A to Z and try to do it, because they will discover something that matters. Then knowledge production, consumption patterns, corporate responses, and fossil fuel divestment, as well as climate protests and social movements. So this is kind of the range that we looked at, and then we looked at the dynamics of these drivers, and it was a long process to get to this framework. It might look banal now, but certainly to me, I have been leading in the way of devising this model together with my colleague Stefan Eichhut, who's a sociologist, and we pair from an experience where his background is very strong in France. In the French world, French literature, mine's much more English, and so that helped in the way of bringing different thinking of the social science together. But there were other colleagues involved from other regions as well. Now, the zooming in and follow-up research leads to the current outlook. We expected here that the resources that we observed would obtain visibility, and then through use add a degree of materiality, which makes them not only visible, but recognized as useful repertoires. And again, this follows kind of the Charles Tilly's writing on historical scripts, which appear and to which movements relate later on or in the future, because they have been proved useful earlier. And so this is something that we apply here as well. And we argue that the shift from accumulated resources to meaningful repertoire generates enabling conditions in the global opportunity structure. But of course, this needs to happen, and this is what we were up against in order to figure out what happened. Just one example here on the assessment framework with social drivers that relate quite closely to one another: knowledge production, climate mitigation, and climate governance. Visible resources here are the IPCC report, climate models, transnational mitigation networks, legal precedents. Sorry, it's a bit and it comes up again. And so these are resources that are out there for drivers to use around the world. Now, through collective action, that's the importance of agency that comes in. These resources obtain sort of materiality, which we then see as repertoires which have an influence on constraining or enabling structures, like climate damage attribution, climate and financial risk assessments, climate emergency in the media. And then we could say, where will one driver go? Will it have a positive? Will it have a negative dynamic? Which drivers are more closely related to each other? This is, of course, more a schematic model. But in each driver assessment, each research group would ask kind of 5 follow-up questions. Which drivers does your driver relate most closely to, and what do you expect with reference to the global opportunity structure, and so on. And you'll find these reports in the publication, where each driver is sort of thoroughly presented in the annex. Now, for the climate litigation case, I'll zoom you in even a little further. so that you would see how would one kind of driver look like. Visible resources here are the Global Climate Summit, the Paris Agreement, targets, legal precedents, emission trading, and attribution science. Then we move on. What are types of individual or collective action? And obviously we have various cases that are not the Shell case. People will know the German Constitutional Court case, where actually the German leader of the Fridays for Future, Neubauer, brought the case with the group before the German Constitutional Court, and it actually led to constitutional change because they won the case. So that's a big thing. And this is happening, and this sets a precedent and provides for reference for others, not just in Germany. I mean, we have some lawyers involved who are also have been working for Greenpeace for a while. So the effects on resources, we distinguish that according to legal, social, political, economic resources, and then we can see in which way it does that. I mean, that's of course very detailed, especially when, as we did in this case, we had some very good lawyers on board, and then the joy of working with detail is sometimes overwhelming, I would say, but it's great, you know, and people, it's very good to have different knowledge backgrounds in one project. And the lawyer with whom we worked here, Katrin Zengerling from the University of Freiburg, is certainly in the field there. Now, from the 2021 outlook, we found that given the observable trajectories of these social drivers, decarbonization is more plausible. And then we argue that while it would be extremely useful for climate action to be able to determine the probability of these climate futures, we assume that we have only very limited capabilities of predicting emissions futures due to the inherent complexities and contingencies of social dynamics. And that's really one thing why we require these assessments pretty regularly, because on the one hand, societal agency changes very quickly, but the structural measures and policy implementation, that often takes much longer. So we are operating on different time frames, which puts the pressure on societal agency right now. And we know the debates, especially with the protest movements and last generation and so on, where ethics questions arise and how far can we go and so on. So we see that there is a field that's currently playing out, and that would be my personal observation. We need to rescue the core of these strategies that might be useful from becoming adopted by and taken over by populist movements. That's really important, and therefore we need more communication. So the next outlook begins with the communication with our own natural scientists much more. So I'm speaking about the current outlook now, where we look at the temperature goals. And the leading assumption is that the current social driver dynamics undermine the possibility of decarbonization. We know that already. So what is the effect then of the interplay between physical processes and social drivers? And here we now put social drivers and physical processes on a path. That's the best we can do here. And we are looking at this is our path, our egg, which leads to the path. I can get you there in a moment. So we call this the integrated plausibility assessment framework, given that the assessed social dynamics and empirical evidence demonstrated that deep decarbonization is not plausible. It might still be possible, and we worked here with a very prevalent public opinion or public perception that what about the technical and physical processes? Aren't they all there? Isn't there a tipping point when we can't do anything anyways? And this is certainly not something that we would, our findings would support. So to account for the complexity of the social and physical worlds, our methodology integrates social and physical plausibility assessments, which results in an interdisciplinary framework, which is like something like that. And again, I go into this now a little bit more. So the figure illustrates how social drivers are in the gray arrow in the middle, talked about earlier, and physical processes like polar ice, ice sheet melt, permafrost thaw, American instability, and Arctic sea ice decline, as well as Amazon forest dieback. How would they influence the physical boundary conditions? And you see the physical boundary conditions in this sort of egg form. So we need to take into account that these processes influence each other, of course, but how, to what extent is the question. And the opportunity structure, as you see now, is the blue area in the center, that still works as a clearing station in order to assess the plausibility, but we also have the physical boundary conditions to take into account. And we put all this on the path with our view on the future climate scenario. So, this assessment we show leads to a conjecture about the plausibility of the selected climate scenario. It's not explaining everything, it's one climate scenario that we're looking at. The next assessment will look at a different scenario. For the future climate scenario, the circle represents the climate futures, the 1.5 degree, the Paris Agreement, up to 2%. Then the social plausibility remains central to limiting the global surface temperature, and the physical plausibility is assessed also with respect to a global surface temperature increase to below 2 degrees. Now, our findings there are, given the observable trajectories of social drivers, deep decarbonization by 2050 is not plausible. The selected physical processes show that they inhibit the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature goals only moderately. That's really very little impact provided by these physical processes, if at all, although they can substantially modify the physical boundary conditions for society. Again, the reference is to society. The two findings, 1.5 and 2 degrees, can become plausible, as I said in the beginning, if ambition, implementation, and knowledge gaps are closed. So zooming out and future research, we come to a conclusion here, and I'll come to my path. This is the path. The wonderful model, unfortunately, we shouldn't probably have to say this, but that's what it is. It's a bit smaller so overpopulation of the PowerPoint, but at the moment, that's my capacity of presenting it here. So we see social drivers and physical processes on the path toward the climate future scenario in which global climate mitigation goals are attained. We see drivers and processes in the gray area, which are first ambivalent about reaching deep decarbonization of social drivers, or they do not affect the plausibility, as in case of the physical processes, which are listed at the end. And you see physical processes and ambivalent effects in polar ice sheet melt, Arctic sea ice decline, regional climate change and variability, and media. You see more happening and sort of in the mid-range of social drivers there in this light blue area. That's where, while we say currently it's not plausible, we see a possibility of these drivers enhancing each other in a productive and positive way. But you see the hexagonal two drivers, the corporate responses and consumption patterns, which are really problematic at the moment. And you see also the social processes which only moderately kind of inhibit the Paris temperature goals in the second hexagon. So currently no driver is on the path of supporting decarbonization, and that is worrisome, and it puts some pressure on us on kind of where to go with future research as well. And we intend to look at much more sort of a diversity of agency, what type of agency, how does agency actually work. So that goes beyond the driver model, it zooms in more. So future scope and pace of social transformations of climate action are crucial for attaining the Paris temperature goal. And that's really what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Well, admiration for the complexity that you take on, only in terms of the subject matter, thinking about climate change and the drivers, but also the complexity of working with such a large network of multidisciplinary scholars. And I can only imagine, what this means. But you can see how you condensed it into a format that is also communicable to different audiences. I think that's a real art, and I see you well on your way there for this cluster. Who wants to start us off with questions? Peter, don't be shy.
So one just expression of puzzlement, and then one question. So the expression of puzzlement, I don't want an answer from you because I think neither of us understand the future. How could sea ice melt not have an impact on the attainment of the goals if it risks seriously affecting the ecology in the ocean of oxygen down the way? So anyway, so here's my question. I like your distinction between feasibility in terms of the natural processes and the plausibility in terms of the social dynamics. And one of the obstacles that you highlighted in that context that I think is very important is the distributive dimension of this, right? So I was in a presentation, unfortunately I don't remember what it was, but I still have this screenshot here on my computer about France. So in France, the top 10% of the population in terms of emissions produce almost 75% of the emissions. And they would need to reduce their emissions by 87% to meet the climate targets, whereas the 50% bottom of the population in terms of emissions could actually increase theirs slightly. So that to me seems to be a huge challenge, how we tackle that. And the tool that economists usually advocate as the most effective tool to tackle climate change, namely a carbon tax, is completely ineffective here because it's regressive, right? So if I'm the rich person flying my private jet around the world, what do I care if it gets a little more expensive with a bit more carbon tax, right? So in other words, what we need, I think, targeted measures, I don't know, could be individual carbon budgets, right? Or progressive, something like the Finns did with traffic violations, right? So once you fly a bit more than that, well, it becomes prohibitively more expensive. So what in your project speaks to that particular challenge of how you incentivize the people who are actually the biggest part of the problem to change their ways?
Would you like me to?
I think we can keep it, interactive. So please just try to.
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm clearly, as you will have noticed, I'm not an expert for the physical processes. So, and so I can't really say that much about it. I think it's from what I take it, what my colleagues are telling us is that the process is so slow by themselves that what we need in terms of activity which can actually make a change, generate a change, is on the side, on the onus on society, if you wish, because these are the short-term changes that we now, not tomorrow, but to because what you have with what I learned from our natural scientists is the predictions that they make vary with reference to the degree of certainty. And so that is, with which degree of certainty can you actually make this kind of prediction? And so often I read this is sort of with very little certainty or whatever the degree there is. Because when you have a change in the models, in natural science models, most of these models develop somehow in a way that they have an upward development. And if you just look like kind of 1 degree change in one direction, and whereas when we look at societal factors, the effect might be much more complex. It needs to be translated through interaction with others. And so what we see is with the social scientists in the project, we undertake much more kind of observations and an evaluation of the available data. Try to add to these data. So we do experiments, public opinion research, we do interpretive, discursive, and so on, really the range of social science analysis in order to gather the data. And this comes to your question, like what would be how do we seek to influence the strategies? That's of course always in Germany we would say ein heikler Punkt. It's a bit sensitive. Obviously, we are scientists, academics. So what we try to do is, which was really an uphill struggle and has been at the moment, how to actually interact with society. Our media presence, the presentation of the data. We feel that this outlook, which sometimes you really think, well, it's just, say what we're doing anyways, and there's the large scientific project, it goes over 6 years, but it's these interactions with the public that we undertake based on this research that make a difference already. And we have, of course, our scientists are sitting on the councils, new advisory boards established on the city level, on the land level, province level, and the national level, internationally. Our scientists write in the IPCC report are part of that. They are taking part in the COPs and in the conference of the parties. So there's a lot of involvement there. Yeah.
We come back. Yeah, sure. To me, that raises a fundamental methodological point. No amount of data can tell us what to do. So we need some kind of premises about what the goals are. If we want to say anything about how we should respond to that. So is that part of your mandate of this project, or is that not part of your mandate? To give policy recommendations.
No, there are obviously because people are sitting on these panels. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Peter's living proof you need a philosopher and all this kind of thing. But it makes things more complex. But that's in a way, it adds to the challenges in your project, right? If you condense all this information into policy suggestions, right, or even strategies forward, right? Yeah, that's it's definitely beyond the scope of an individual researcher, but it is the uncertainty that is built into the whole process. I mean, it's a unique challenge that we have with climate change, right? Because we plan over what is now next 27 years or so, in 2050. So the uncertainty that is built into these processes, right, you have to figure it's definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the point, for example, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, from the sessions and the collaboration with Jim that we had here, the need of access to contestation is part of this project. I mean, certainly in the way that I argue in the sensitive regions project, where we look at contested norms of governance, we go, we undertake interviews with local stakeholders, and it's really interesting how you have changes in norms such as belief in progress, which will often enhance the power of leaders in the Gulf region who would have made their fortune and power based on oil. But then in the future, as one of my experts simply on my postdocs said laconically, said, well, now they are based on oil, and the next they would simply switch solar energy for oil, and then there's still nothing will have changed in terms of the distribution of wealth in that region. And so, but this comes down to the norm of belief in progress, and then if you can sort of relate that back to long-standing liberal economic theories like Oslo's idea of the democratization, where you had to have sort of the implement of direct investments and so on, modernization becomes before democratization. These problems are now catching up with us in various ways. And so that's, of course, where we come in and basically say, it's nice to have a reference in the Paris Agreement to knowledge holders, but do they therefore also have a say? Or are they forced to the table in the last minute? If, what are the conditions of participation? Maybe I should say something about the driver of knowledge production, where we distinguish, following Donna Haraway, situated knowledge and a network of knowledge holders. That is the background knowledge. Then you have technical knowledge that is acquired through interaction, academic work, and so on. And only in the end, what we see in these negotiations in the global context, is we have packaged knowledge. And what we see, the packaged knowledge, which is fed into regulatory policy making, that's the tip of the iceberg, we would argue, against the background of diverse ways of knowing. So there's a lot of, if you wish, philosophical considerations about equality and injustice fed into the way that we undertake this research. Yeah.
Jutta, thank you for joining us from Brazil today. If you want, you can switch on. Then Amanda has a question, so maybe we go to the. All of it. You want to look me? Okay. Jutta, if you're able, do you want to post your question?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Antje. To me, it was not surprising to see consumption patterns and corporate responses as major inhibitors for decarbonization. I was wondering what your group came up with in terms of strategies to really target these two major drivers. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe Jutta, I can just add to you, because that was in a way my first reaction. When you talk about drivers, do you look at breakers, so to speak? Those who have their very deliberate strategies to prevent decarbonization with vested interest. Be it elites, be it the carbon industry, and so forth. Right? So you see those driving towards these goals, but there are also those who with very many resources trying to prevent this moving forward. So a combination of Jutta and my question. Greetings to Brazil, Jutta.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Brazil, Jutta, thank you very much for the question. The drivers, that's of course a concept, and drivers are overarching social processes which entail agents. And the drivers can drive in various directions, and as I said in the presentation, some drivers turn out to be their dynamics are not conducive towards reaching the scenario. And what my colleague, especially Anita Engels, who's one of the speakers of the cluster, and she's a sociologist, whereas the other speaker, Jochen Marotzke, is the director of the One Institute for Earth
Open science.
And so what Engels does, for example, they bring together groups where corporate responses that have panels where these corporate agents are brought together and they meet regularly. So that's an idea of sensing application. the way in which they others in which they move. And Brazil is actually one aspect, one country that plays a strong role there. I think China is part of it, India, and since that's not the driver that I have mainly carried out research on, I can't detail that much more here.
Thanks very much. Very interesting presentation, to say the least. Very detailed and a lot of study just to understand all the different aspects you're bringing in. But I look at an example here in British Columbia of in transportation in particular. It has taken off in the last few years with people moving to and choosing electric vehicles. And most of that, right now, Vancouver in the last quarter of last year, 25% of new vehicle sales were electric. Across BC, it's 20%. The government's projection was for that to get there in 25 or 26. So their target, by the time they set the target, we'd already gone past it. But what's driving this? There are a number of factors, but a lot of it is your social side of it. Is that we have enough vehicles in town. It's probably 5,000 or 6,000 in Victoria, so people could see them. They talk to their neighbors about them. They find out, geez, things cost nothing to run, and they're very reliable. And so maybe I'll consider that next time. The existence of rebates were important, but that's less and less important now because the people who initially bought the electric vehicles are more well-to-do people. Some of us are not so well-to-do, found second-hand ones. And but now even second-hand ones are ridiculously expensive. But the sharing of knowledge within a community, I think, was a bigger driver than the rebates. But there's tremendous forces against it still. The New York Times just did a large article yesterday or the day before condemning electric vehicles. CBC constantly will never do a story on it without raising questions. Oh, you can't use it in Manitoba or Northern Ontario or something like that. That's not as practical. They'll always find something to diminish the value of them and to make people hesitant about buying them. In BC, where we have these policies and the government makes much, takes much credit for it, really doesn't deserve, I don't think, in large measure, because it's a social thing more than the government directed. The LNG plant we're building up in Kitimat is going to have emissions, life cycle emissions, of over 2 times BC's total emissions today. So the little bit that we save on electric vehicles and installing heat pumps in a home is negligible compared to the increase that we're going to get. And one question, I have 2 questions for you. One is, can we cut emissions significantly enough in democracies, because we're the biggest polluters outside China? Is it possible in a democracy to get people to make the cuts necessary to reach the 1.5, let alone the 2? And the second question is, the way we account for emissions by nation. We only account for the emissions emitted within that nation. So in Canada, 80% of oil production is exported. When they talk about net zero in the oil industry, they're talking about 12% of the emissions of the oil related that they're, the associated oil. So we're only talking about the emissions getting out of the ground, processing it to a state that we can put it in the pipeline and get it to the border. The combustion, which is 85–90% of emissions, is done in another country. So every country gets assessment. Until the countries, if we start labeling these things as, I'm not saying don't do what we do now, but I'm saying we need an additional layer of information where countries are assessed by their role in global emissions as opposed to just their own emissions from their countries. And I'm wondering if anybody was thinking of that.
No, I think you're hitting on a very important point there that still, despite globalization, it's very hard to think in a global way and to make global politics. I assessed it in my talk on Monday. when we talk about global ordering, what is global and how do we actually, in one way, everything is global, but as things get tight and problematic politically, then all of a sudden we push back into the national. And the populists will always sell the retreat in the domestic sort of realm as something which will be the ultimate savior. If we do it right, then we'll be fine. And that is, I think, something that comes back to the first what's kind of the ethical aspect of this, and I think that's for all of us to think. Yeah, sure. I mean, as a citizen, I would certainly I would even be critical of the use of e-cars as long as we use the rare earths from Argentina and prevent the farmers from farming, because their water supplies are reduced in considerable numbers. And so as long as these transnational, global, international issues have to be addressed, what's the advantage of having clearing the emissions from one country when another country therefore has more? And we're in the second project, and this might be satisfied to a certain extent. In reply to the question, we have a project that addresses the larger question: where does all the carbon go? You know, what's actually where is it stored? What's happening? And we can't just get rid of it and move it across the border. So that's certainly something that is there. But I think especially also the knowledge production. Knowledge production is a key issue, and the way that we presented it, the observation of how neighborhoods are, how conversations in communities matters. That is all part of what the media can't cover by themselves, and not journalism in the traditional sense. So there's certainly a big role to be played by social media and other ways of communication.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. That's very, very interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with one, and that is, I was wondering if you found differences or interlinkages with the question of how democratic a society or political system is in the way they're able to change, but also in the relevance of different social drivers. Because I can imagine that, like, more deliberative societies like social movements or journalism play a different role. But on the other side, as you said, like, of course, in a more authoritarian society, it's maybe easier to push measures through. So I was wondering if you worked on that in any way.
Possibly the social protest, social movement driver group, that they might have looked at that, but it's not a key aspect. I think, and I can always thank you for that, since you might have guessed, political scientists are largely underrepresented in this project. So no, I think it's a very important point that also connects back to the previous question. What is actually possible? What can we do given the way that societies are organized in a particular way, which comes back to the question of order. Is liberal order the only way? Then what could be better, different? And what kind of replacements for that do we have? To do regional orders help us. There are regional organizations, international organizations, but certainly in my field in international relations, there is quite some concern about the authority of international organizations and the role that you see about the Russian aggression, the entire decline of the rule of law, and you know, how stable are the rules that we've got, as you know, both nationally and internationally. So yes, I think that's I couldn't agree more. Thank you also for the talk. The plausibility, feasibility distinction is scary, but I think very useful. Imagine running with it, and I would love to see the report you produce. I wonder if you see this as, I mean, you're working at this, you don't want to call it global, but fairly global level. Do you think that the framework you're providing has any diagnostic value for identifying leverage points at, say, a national level? Could you sort of take this framework, apply it, and sort of figure out, well, what is the, where could we work most successfully, probably first in our study, whereas in Jamaica or Australia or somewhere else, they would apply and get a different result.
Yeah, just to clarify, no, I like the term global a lot, and I work with it all the time. It's more the question of level, where I sometimes have a bit of a problem, because level always implies the understanding that something is organized according to levels, so that will leave out a lot of, shall we say, tribal constellations or in different ways of organizing society. That's why I think scale sometimes, with regard to the reach of a policy, that, but I think we agree probably. And I like the idea of the leverage points, and we don't have them pointed out, but the beginning is there. Maybe if we just have established these frameworks, these assessment frameworks, and we are beginning to do this for Germany. And then I'm sure that there will be a comparative study that will follow. And we also hope that, if that's part of our mission when we talk about this model around the world, people might find it useful and apply it to study other drivers. And then we could come together on that and see exactly that. Where can we work best? Maybe also knowledge production as a driver that works particularly well in one societal context, but not in others. Maybe some drivers require more translation into different negotiation contexts. I think that would be actually really good. Yes. Maybe you would want to become part of it.
Sure. Very well here. I think we spent 5 or 10 minutes. We will have a fellow coming back this summer, and one of his field of expertise is climate engineering. I'm just wondering whether this entered in all the knowledge that you took into account here. I know it's very controversial with whether we use our technologies to manipulate the climate if we can't control carbon emissions to a degree necessary. Is this something that you decide to look at all, or to enter the debate that we have in the German context?
Sorry, I was just wondering. I had a sensation that I was off at the moment, because you were talking about somebody who's coming in.
Yeah, no, when he brings an important expertise, he always reminds us that he is very much plugged into the policy context in the US about climate engineering. And so whether this is a knowledge and an approach that enters the debate, right here, to what degree do we see this as a possible, maybe even legitimate part of addressing the problem, like that it is through technologies that allows us to manipulate the climate. So I know how controversial it is, but that's something that is out there, right?
That's you. We are actually currently writing a paper on climate engineering together with Jürgen Schäffmann, Tobias Zumbregel, and Jan Wilkens, who's just nominated as the runner-up for the best article in international affairs on decolonized global governance. So with these people, and we draw on the expertise of the Gulf region and the Arab states, and this hooks up on the point I made a little earlier on this belief in progress, and that's where climate engineering is a very strong aspect. And we have a concern that we call it the kind of the two norms paper, where the belief in progress supported by climate engineering will work in a dynamic which works against the dynamic of climate justice. And so we have the norm of climate justice on the one hand and climate engineering supporting the belief and progress. And that is a key issue, yes, very important.
Yeah. Maybe just sharing, when I was in a meeting with the Atlantic Brücke, which is the Europe and the German North America connection, and there was a debate, it was fascinating to just watch as a sociologist. So on the one hand, there were all the engineers in the room who thought it was primarily technological problems to deal with climate change. Right? What are the new technologies that come on allow us to do this? And then the social scientists said that it has to do with human behavior. It will have our way of living will have to change, but the politicians in the room, they shy away from this because it's very controversial. But you would say, oh, leave it to the German engineer to figure it out, so it's the technology, as we know, that won't be, it is, but it goes far deeper, right, in terms of the changes that are coming to our society. But there is resistance in the policy community and with politicians because it is very uncomfortable, right? And it demands a lot. And the example here of issues of social inequality, what do we do with these huge emitters, right? So how do we tackle it? So you can see how your project will also get into controversy. I'm not sure whether you've encountered it this far. You've done fabulous outreach in the media and so forth. So I'm just wondering, have you encountered also the pushback of the contestation of climate-related issues, right, when it comes to making policy recommendations and so forth, or has it been relatively consensual what you've been coming up with?
Well, I mean, it really depends.
Right.
It depends on where people's interests are and how much people are actually willing to understand, to address climate, not with reference to what's possible. That's what you just said, climate engineering, that's all about possibility. But it's not plausible because it won't work with the societal factors that are involved. So again, it's kind of climate engineering goes into the direction of the revival on sort of Rostow's modernization, which we know that went. And so yes, that's but we are in the end. I mean, we are academics and we can produce data and can refer to scenarios and then it's just decide if we do it. And of course, I mean, that's just one point. I mean, you keep asking about, are there players who purposefully want to enhance, want to provide, sort of want to avoid decarbonization? From the conversation that we have, also kind of off the record, out of the boardroom, I see the contrary happening. For example, if you talk with VW sort of board members or people who are high up in the production process, they would say we could do quite a lot. We're prepared, we have the possibility, but we need to be competitive on the larger, on the world level, on the world context and so on. But the willingness, I would say on the contrary, the willingness is there. I haven't, we can't talk to everybody. I haven't found a willful destructiveness so far, apart from, these arms. It's a different story.
We might see some tipping points in different ways, right, in terms of the public discourse and non-network activities. We have two more questions and then we come to a close and then.
Thank you. I thought it was very interesting research that you did, important research, and I wasn't. I think the social driver. That was a new concept that I thought was very useful to think about. But at the same time, it's important to think about global, like from global scale. But if we think about how, like, individuals or even like smaller community level, what drives, like, when we think it's something that we have to change or it's serious, and existential threat seems not to be the driver of what how we behave, in a way that if I think about myself, like if I'm running out of like a coupon deadline is finishing, and then you go to the store, like that kind of urgency. It's not, it's like that drives people to move, but then existential threat doesn't in a way. So I'm wondering, because you also talked about how different societies or different cultures drive people to behave in a certain way. That can you come up with some actual like a concrete example or concrete finding of, oh, in this community this works, in this community this works better?
And maybe you can.
I guess because
yeah,
we're together, yeah.
right, yeah, I'll take a stand, yeah.
Yeah, it's more like a follow-up on what you're saying, actually, Oliver. I think the main problem is you don't want to be the politician who announces that energy bills are going to increase. And pollution is a cost that any individual, even everyone in the room, is externalizing on society, right? And if you want to curb down pollution, you have to internalize that cost. And I think it's very telling that most of the populist movements of the past 10 years have been partly fueled by, on the discourse that fixed, every individual has a budget, right? So basically, the fixed amount that you have to pay on stuff like energy bills, gas, and so on is basically increasing, right? And so I think it's very telling that Donald Trump, for instance, has made has won significant electoral victories in all states, right? Yeah, from that perspective. And I think the strongest argument for technological change or technological solution to climate change is that this is the only way we can hope to decarbonize or cut down carbon emission while keeping the price bill as it is. And that's, I think, the main argument for trying to look for technological solutions and also for nuclear energy, as I was arguing yesterday in the kitchen.
Okay, we were in part of the kitchen, let's say, I think we get a gist now. So Ante, if you want to.
Well, I take the question as an inspiration to take home with me to discuss. I think one point I definitely wanted to make is we try to avoid working with tipping points. We think that's a really the project dramatizes situations and is not helpful, especially with regard to societal reactions, where you have the last generation reactions. Like if you start talking about tipping points and at one particular point nothing is possible, then you will have a scenario that becomes increasingly implausible. Because then society actors, you cannot bring them behind the argument. Clearly, you still have your physical tipping points. That's a different story. But the discourse about tipping points in the media, we try to not play into the hands of populism.
Ted Dixon, here at the Cascade Institute, his research, he looks at positive tipping points, right? So he tries to think, sure enough, there are those that can prevent really any likelihood of addressing climate change in a positive. But he also says, once, I think here with the electric cars, right? Once we have reach a certain mass, right? Then it's just is unavoidable that it goes there and then phasing out combustion engines. So but he looks at but that would be, it doesn't only have to be this kind of negative, all right, we have reached a tipping point, there's nothing we can do anymore, but
that's the way it's used.
I know.
That's therefore we try to avoid.
Oh, I can see this. Right, so seems a huge agenda ahead of you, but one that that clearly speaks to concerns here in the room and more broad. And I'm still thinking whether there was an encouraging news. The 1.5 seems no longer plausible as you described, but it seems with the focus on actors and the possibility of societies to address this. That's very much alive here, and I can see how the social scientists bring this into the mix and say, look at the actors and look at the possibility of social and individual agency. And I think that could take something away also in terms of encouraging use. I think that might be something that to see as part of the complex mix in which we address this existential threat that we face. So thank you very much, and good luck with this. Keep us informed and send us your reports. We're definitely interested in seeing this, and we can think about how the Canadian context might speak to it and take advantage of the knowledge that you produce. Thank you very much.
Thank you.